we are back for another episode of Passion, Purpose, and Possibilities. And my guest today has a passion for healing. I'd love for you to meet Dr. Maggie Baker. She's the author of Crazy About Money, How Emotions Confuse Our Money Choices and What to Do About It. She's a psychologist and financial therapist motivated by empathy, creativity, and humor to alleviate financial suffering. And I can't wait to dive into this, Maggie, because I don't think a lot of people find humor when it comes to their finances. But welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. And the only way you develop humor about money is when you are either desperate or you have struck it rich.
Yeah.
It has to be extreme because it's not going to come any other way.
That makes complete sense. Can't wait to dive into all of this. But I would love for you to share with our listeners, like your personal story. Like, how did you end up becoming a psychologist and then this focus on financial therapy? Because I know that's not where it started years ago.
No, that's true. Well, it started when I was about ready to graduate from high school, and I got very depressed because my parents had very different ideas for me than I had for me. And I grew up at a time when, women didn't necessarily go to college. And it's kind of funny because my family comes from long generations of being in this country, and you'd think that they would be very much behind women's education. Well, they were very much behind men's education, but not necessarily women. And they just thought, oh, well, she's just going to get married. She'll become a secretary, marry her boss, and have 2.5 children and live in the suburbs behind a white picket fence. And if you'd known me as a teenager, I was kind of rough and tumble. I loved sports. I didn't care about fashion. I was a pretty good student. And all I cared about were my academics and my friends and my sports. But of course, they didn't listen to me until I got very depressed. And then they had to listen, although I think reluctantly. But to make a very long story quite short, I lucked out and went to a very, very good psychologist who really, really helped me and helped my family accept the fact that I wasn't what they wanted me to be. And I was much freer to pursue something that meant something to me. And since I'd gotten so much help from this psychologist, and I'd always been interested in human behavior and had thought as a 13-year-old, maybe I'd go to medical school. But since I'm not that good at math, that didn't work out too well. But I am pretty good at articulating things. So that sent me to psychology and was a comfortable fit, because my therapist had been such an enormously positive influence that I was kind of modeling what I had learned from him. So that's how I got started with the mental focus of my being. And I've continued that my whole life. I've never been anything but a psychologist, and I've never regretted any minute of it. I still, at my elderly age, I still love practicing, and I probably will continue to practice until I can't see or hear.
You hit on a couple things here that I think are important to address, because I know we're not the only ones that have ever been through depression, right? There are so many people out in the world that experience this. And being that, when you were growing up, this was definitely not something that people talked about. How were you able to approach your parents and your family that you were going through this depression? And what was the thing that made them say, okay, we need to get you some help? Or you said, I need some help? I mean, what happened?
Well, I went to a boarding school in New Hampshire, and I grew up in Connecticut. They lived in Connecticut, and the school called them and said, well, this is funny. Not when I was going through it, but I had gone to the headmistress of the school and said, I'm worried about myself because I keep having these weird thoughts and I don't know what that's all about. And she looked at me in horror and she said, well, you're one of the more normal people we have here.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, do you want me to tell you what I'm thinking about? And she kind of said, well, maybe we'll send you to the pediatrician and you can talk to him. So I did. And when I told him, he said, well, maybe you ought to go talk to a psychiatrist. So he called, the school was quite near Dartmouth. So they called the department there to get an appointment for me. But alas, the psychiatrist had just committed suicide. So that didn't work. And so I ended up having to go to the Concord Child Guidance Clinic that was 90 miles away. And the school, fortunately, I went 2 and 3 times a week for about 6 weeks. But they drove me all the way down and all the way back 2 or 3 times a week. And at that point, they talked to my parents, who were absolutely shocked, of course, and very, very reluctant to even support what they were saying. And they just didn't like what they were hearing, so they really tried to avoid it. But they couldn't because it was coming from the school, which a very good thing. And by that time, the psychologist knew that my parents were very reluctant, but he was great handling them. So that allowed me to continue. And I also had a grandfather who was very, very supportive of me. And even though he was kind of a Victorian gentleman, he realized the seriousness of this. And he supported me and he financially paid for it. So the fact that my parents didn't have to pay for it and my grandfather did, I think took a lot of pressure off the situation. And there we are with money right at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
So the thing that is like kind of stopped me in my tracks here is the fact that, now as time goes on, we can find more ways to get help. But when you were going through this, I mean, this was like a major breakthrough because this was not really heard of, where you would just probably suffer through it. So thankfully, you had the support at school and that you were brave enough to speak up for yourself and share how you were feeling. And I think that's like number one key right now for anybody listening. Speak up, share what you're feeling. Don't suffer in silence because there is plenty of help out there. Take maybe just a little bit of research going on your computer and Google. So that's the first thing I want to say. And the other thing is, thankfully your grandfather really stepped in, to be there for you. And I just want to share this because I know when I was growing up and my brother was going through his depression, and he was 9 when it started. He had told me later when he was in his 30s, he's like, I've been depressed since I'm 9 years old. But I think my parents just thought it was like teenage angst that he was going through or pre-adolescent, things because it wasn't talked about enough. And that's why we really need to take the stigma out of mental health and talking about it. And, it's so normal, right? There's so much we have to deal with. It's so normal. So now let's talk about how the financial piece started to come into play for you. And as you had just mentioned, like your grandfather was paying for your therapy. So what kind of impact did that have on you?
Well, huge because, he had the power. And I learned very early how powerful money is right there. And I don't think I recognized it then. I just was so happy that I had this person who believed in me and who was willing to financially support me. But money had been a real issue growing up with my family because both my parents came from quite rich backgrounds. But my father, had taken the easy way out and found a love affair with alcohol. And a very, very bright man who went to 2 years of Annapolis, but then didn't like Annapolis and went to live in France with his father, who was quite a famous person in the Navy and was living, quite the life of Riley until his father got sick of him and kind of said, you've got to go get a job. But he was so used to that kind of lifestyle, that was hard for him to hear. So he kind of did. He became a small businessman, but he also, had a tremendous difficulty with alcohol. And that limited his ability to really earn. And, I would hear stories growing up of how they grew up. And, I'd kind of look around me as a kid and think, oh, this is really different. This is not like what they're talking about. So I've had that kind of, I guess I would call it a marginality, where I couldn't completely buy into the environment that I was living in because it was pretty chaotic and on the crazy side. And at the same time, there were certain things that were fine. And the most fine thing, of course, was my grandfather, who lived a mile away. And that was a great source of strength and direction for me, that without which I think I would have been in much worse shape. But, when the reality that you're experiencing, whether you're 5 years old or 25 years old, doesn't match what you're hearing, there's that discrepancy. It sets up kind of both anxiety, but also kind of recognition of how complicated life can be. And so in that sense, I had to grow up really fast. Otherwise, I hardly could make sense of what was happening, but it would have been a lot worse, if I'd been able to stay as a child and not feel such a heavy sense of either responsibility or kind of doom, like, what's going to be the result of all this? So, you get wise before your time, in a sense.
Right, right. So you get through boarding school
Uh-huh.
and then you go to college.
Uh-huh.
And so you're majoring in psychology.
Yep.
And then what happens?
Well, then I realized that a BA is not going to be enough to really do what I want to do. So I decided I'd get a PhD or a master's or a PhD. So I set out on that pursuit. And the good thing about that is that, first of all, it was really interesting to me. And secondly, I got a job because I did have to earn money. And again, my grandfather contributed, but I also had to work. And I got a job at Philadelphia General Hospital. And there I met my to-be husband. He was a psychiatric resident. And where I was working had a program for the University of Pennsylvania residency. So I met him in the halls, and we got married. At that point, I was 28. So I was ready to get married, and he was too. So that happened pretty fast. And that was a very, very good thing. He unfortunately died in 2015, but I mean, he was a very bright, ambitious person, and we matched in many, many different ways. The most important to him, he said he couldn't marry a woman who either knew how to ski or was willing to learn how to ski.
That's what he wanted?
Yeah.
Oh, that's what he wanted. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So can you ski or did you
Well,
have to learn?
No. Fortunately, the boarding school was in New Hampshire, and I started to ski when I first went there. I was almost 13 when I went, and I was on the ski team by the time I left. And also a friend of mine and I started the women's ski team at Boston University, where I ended up going to college. So I was very, very imbued with skiing. So he was delighted when he heard that. This is really funny. One of his friends was terrified that he wouldn't continue to date me because he had a habit of going out with women 4 or 5 times and then just losing interest. So we had gotten together with he and his 18-month-old kid and his wife, and his name was Hillel Swiller. And he all of a sudden he said, "Oh, would you two like to go on a ski trip with us to Switzerland for 3 weeks?" And before anybody could say anything, I said, "Oh, yeah, that sounds great." And we ended up getting engaged in Grindelwald.
Oh, wow. That is some story. And that was just the clincher, all right? As soon as you said yes, that was it. Oh, that's a lovely story. So you started a practice I would assume, or what happened?
Well, fortunately, working at PGH, the work demands were not that great. So I spent a lot of time going to all the conferences that the psychiatric residents were attending. And one day, one of the attendings came up and asked if I wanted to join his private practice and see low fee patients, as a way of starting. So I
Mhm.
did. And that started my private practice that I've continued to this day.
I mean, obviously, I mean, this is your passion. This is what you love doing, is helping people. So now that you've been doing this for many years, how did the financial therapist part evolve for you?
Oh, okay. My husband was a year older, but when I was 49, 50, it became clear to me that I was getting older. And that one day I probably wouldn't be able to work the way I was working because I was working 45 and 50 hours a week. So I realized that I'd had this notion that, men were the only ones that were really good with money. So obviously my white knight husband was going to take care of the money. Well, he had as little interest in that as he had in throwing himself in a super hot swimming pool. He just didn't put much into it. And we had a series of CPAs that some were okay and some were not even okay. But he wasn't very discerning about that. And one day I walked into his office and he kind of sheepishly turned around to see me coming in. And I thought, that's not like him. And so looking over his shoulder, I saw what he was doing, which was paying a $25,000 tax bill on a credit card, or he was trying to do that. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is not the way you manage money, and something is really wrong. So that created a lot of conflict in the beginning because I said, that's just, you can't keep doing that. And how about I take over the money? Not because I know what I'm doing, but I'm terrified that if this is what you've been doing, this isn't going to work. And both of us earned enough money. So we didn't pay that much attention to it in detail, which was obviously not very good. But anyway, I took over and we had an investment advisor who had been the father of the woman who made my wedding dress. And I had the naive notion that he would really take care of us the way he was taking care of his own daughter. We'd be special.
Mhm.
Alas, we weren't special. And he didn't do a bad job, but he didn't do a good job either. So I fired him and found somebody else who was much, much better, more. This is my cat. Put her down because she's very distracting. I found through another friend somebody who was much more engaged and much more progressive and greedy, which tended to match my anxious feelings of, I don't think we'd be doing as well as we should, so we got to make up for lost time. So I was very willing to go along with being quite risk-taking with stocks. And this continued through the 90s when the stock market was really hot. And I found it kind of entrancing. And the investment advisor was also feeding that because he was so excited. And long story short, we got to March of 2000 and the bottom fell out of the market. And I got absolutely frozen in terms of making decisions. And, he was encouraging me to sell, but I was so scared that I couldn't make a decision and I couldn't trust my husband because he probably would have never gotten into the market in the same way. So I didn't. I held on, which was encouraged by a couple of my other colleagues who knew a lot about money. And long story short, I just watched the whole market collapse and we lost several $100,000 and I just collapsed into a depression because I felt so responsible And at the time, women tend to privatize shame and discomfort that makes them look bad. So I wasn't able to really share this with anybody, which made it worse. And it was kind of a recapitulation in a way of my original depression, only in a very, very different form. But the crux of it was the power of money. And it took me about a year and a half to unwind from that and finally realize that it bothered me a lot. Since I was supposed to know myself well enough as a psychologist, I wouldn't fall into pitfalls. But I fell into a really big one until one day I was in the shower and I was watching the water just come down, just kind of floating down. And all of a sudden I just burst into tears. And I just sobbed and got out of the shower and said, okay, now I can do something. I've kind of gotten unstuck. So I interviewed about 10 different financial advisors and found one that I really liked. I joined an investment club and learned how to analyze stocks. And just at this time, behavioral economics had come into play. And Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky had won the Nobel Prize in economics for 2002. The whole notion of people being irrational about money was really taking hold. And at the same time, that was producing the growth of the joining of psychology, sociology, and economics in the psychology space to form financial therapy. So that was kind of just good luck more than anything else that my situation coincided with an external development of looking at the irrationality of people's behavior with money.
Oh my gosh. That is luck, right? The stars were aligned for those two things to happen. So I have a question for you though.
Sure.
What would you tell the person that's listening feels paralyzed?
Oh. That's a tough one because a lot of people think, well, you have to wade through it and find the origin of the stuckness in order to move out of the stuckness. And I would say that all of that is important, but to get out of it, I wish somebody had kind of almost slapped me in the face and said, just do something, but, in a compassionate, empathic way. Because I believe at this point, if somebody came into my office, I would say, where are you not stuck? There must be some aspect of your life that's not stuck. Maybe it's just a teeny corner of it, but can you make your bed in the morning? Can you feed your family? Can you go out to the movies with a friend? These are places you're not stuck. So let's look at those places and let's get you more active in the places where you're not stuck. And as we go along, we can look at how you got stuck. But I would advocate very, very strongly that action will start to build the confidence much better than going back over how you got stuck and why you're ashamed and all the negative feelings. Because once you start exploring them, even if you're getting a compassionate response back from a therapist or a friend, you're still mining the negative. And there's, the negativity bias. We're all built to kind of exaggerate the things that could go wrong as a way of trying to keep ourselves safe. And you don't need more help to stimulate that.
So, how do you become like money resilient or financially resilient?
With a lot of practice. It comes with a lot of practice. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 20 years, trying to, specialize in this. And I can still find myself, I don't want to look at that bill. I don't want to, do this, that, or I don't want to look at my stocks, but you just have to kind of push through it. And, I found ways like I have a wonderful financial advisor now. And if I get panicked, I call him and he can pull me back. I can talk with my current boyfriend, who is as frugal as he outtops me in frugality. So I can talk to him and he can kind of talk me down which is good. So
Right.
you have to have people, no matter how much you love to talk about money, which I do. I probably am much better talking about somebody else's money than my own, but I'm pretty good at talking about my own at this point. But it reminds me of a study that was done about what people talked about day to day in their family life. And money was topic number 6 because and people's reaction was, who wants to go there, because it's in a couple, it's going to be a fight. That's what they anticipate. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's what they anticipate. So they keep avoiding it and putting it off, which is why some people end up in my office when there's a crisis and they can't put it off anymore.
Now, I know from looking at the things that you do, I mean, you have the most amazing blog posts. There's so much information on Maggie's website, so I definitely encourage everybody to go check that out, which your website will definitely be in our show notes. But there's different types of like money types. Like each person carries different thoughts around money. So can we talk a little bit about that? Maybe for the listener, there'll be a light bulb moment that says, I'm like that, or maybe I'm a combination of, a couple of these types.
Right. Well, descriptively, there are 6 types that I think about. And the first one is the spender, who gets a lot of satisfaction from spending money and is very much in the moment. And there are a lot of good things about that. First of all, it's fun, and it can be very inclusive of other people because you go to a store and everybody gets excited about what you're going to buy. And the satisfaction is getting something immediate. And of course, the long-term consequences of that is not so good. But people who like to be spontaneous and are just they get satisfaction out of that intensity are going to do that. And that is a personality type. Now, how do they get to be that way? We start learning about money when we're 4 and 5, a lot about the facts of money, but what the emotional part comes from is mainly the climate in the family. So you can have parents who don't have that much money, but they can talk about it in a very positive way and reassure a kid that they have enough money to take care of them. And they transmit that. You can have another family that's hugely rich, but they're always talking about money in a conflictual way. And the kid picks that up and starts to, worry. Oh gosh, maybe there won't be enough. And maybe I have to be very, very careful and not ask for too much, even though they may see a lot of, good things around them materially. But, people are idiosyncratic and the way their minds work are very, very different. So somebody in that situation could say, well, I never want to think about money. So when I grow up, I'm going to be really, really good with money and careful with money and save with money and never have to be in, bad conflict about it. So that type of person is a saver. They get their satisfaction out of saving, watching their portfolios grow, watching their bank accounts grow, and they would rather have that growth at the end of the month rather than a bill for a fancy dinner, which their spouse might choose instead. So you can see the kind of conflict that would come from that. And then there's the hoarder type who's so scared to deal with money that they just want to keep it under the mattress. And when they keep it under the mattress, it doesn't work for them because the value of money changes and it usually gets more and more diluted as prices go up and as stocks go up. So their fear is so great they don't think about money. They just think about the fear they have of it. And then there's the other extreme, which is the high roller who loves to take risks and will go gamble and just love the immediacy of, boy, I'm a special guy because I can win. And the problem with the gambler is that they only take count of their wins, not their losses. So they can kind of fancy themselves as very, very good at something that they're probably not that good at, just because of the way they tally it up. And then there's the money monk, who is the type of person who doesn't want to get near money because they think it's morally kind of dirty lucre. And they can cite the Bible about that, but the Bible really says that what's wrong is the love of money, not the actual having of it. But they're the type that becomes, professors, or gets a wife who loves to take care of the money so they don't have to think about it. And they're kind of above it. And then there's the avoidant worrier who worries about money but avoids doing anything about it. And all of these types are based on, I think, temperament number one, because you can have a family with 2 kids and one's very frugal and one's not. And, how do you explain that? So part of it is temperament, part of it is the family input, part of it is the peer group, especially during adolescence. And I think that another factor is the kids who find work and they associate work with earning money and independence. That's another influence that has a strong component in crystallizing somebody's reactions with money. And most people have a dominant type, but that doesn't mean that in smaller ways they can act differently. They can act like a money monk, or they can act like a high roller, or a hoarder, or a saver, or whatever. But there is a core that is really there for the long term. I mean, I grew up, certainly there was so much conflict and difficulty around money that I grew up being very, very careful with it, contrary to my greedy period.
Yeah. Well, we all go through life transitions and, can definitely start out one way and leads us to something else. But what made you decide to write your book?
The advisor that I went to that was conservative, one of the messages, I told him I wanted to have the most diverse portfolio possible, to kind of make up for the narrow focus I had on tech stocks. And he saw me go through the depression and everything, and he saw me go out of it. And he said, Maggie, you're not the only one who suffered a great loss. And of course, I'd been so self-absorbed, it was only my loss that I was really concerned about. And all of a sudden, it was like, yeah, you're right. And he said, you should write a book. And I had written some academic papers and everything, and I'd gotten a little disenchanted with that because so few people read them. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. So he started me on that, and I got rolling and found it pretty interesting. So I just continued.
So the book is titled Crazy About Money: How Emotions Confuse Our Money Choices and What to Do About It. And I know that gives us a really good description of what it's about, but what else do you want our listeners to know about this book, why they should read this book?
They should read it trying to better their own relationship with money. And when I ask people, please describe your relationship to money, a lot of them don't know what I'm talking about. And I said, well, you deal with money every day. You have feelings about money. You have a relationship with your house. You have a relationship with the people in your life. Why wouldn't you have a relationship with money? And one of the exercises that I love that was developed by Olivia Mellon, she was my first mentor in this area. And what she proposed was think of money as a person and write a dialogue that you would have with money. So for instance, if you were to start a dialogue, you could say, money, why are you always running away from me? And then you'd have to create an answer from money. And money might say, well, if I had the holes in my pockets the way you have, that's a good reason why I'm running away from you. And, then it goes back and forth. And then you look at it and you say, what are your reactions to it? What would your parents' reactions be to it? And how would your ideal self react to this? And that usually helps somebody understand that, in fact, they do have a relationship with money.
Oh, what a great exercise. I mean,
Not a great exercise.
yeah, perfect journal prompt.
The other thing is that when I've read self-help books, I can tell that a lot of people who put questions, at the end of the chapter, they're just making up the questions. They've never answered them themselves. So I decided I was going to answer them as truthfully as I could myself. If I was going to be presumptuous enough to ask somebody to be able to do that, I should be able to do that. So I did. So at the end of each chapter, there are the questions, and then you can see my answers. And then I encourage everybody to use that as kind of a template so they can write their own answers. And I've found that when people write things down, it imprints a whole lot better than just talking about it.
Oh, most
So,
definitely. I totally agree with that.
so that's one feature of the book. And the other is that I did it from a developmental point of view, starting with childhood and going all the way up through legacy and becoming a money master. And I wanted to be an awareness book, and I didn't want it just to be facts about money, which it certainly is not. It's about stories that my clients have told me, and I've gotten permission from all of them to use them in the book. So what I was hoping is that people would see themselves in these stories, and it would help them become aware of, oh, gee, maybe that's me. There's somebody out there that's been going through it, and they are very similar to me in going through something like this. So maybe I'm not so bad, or maybe I can get a little more unstuck because I know that this guy, Christopher, in the book did X, Y, and Z, and I can see myself doing that. And maybe that's not a good idea, and maybe I should do something about it.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about, book or otherwise, that you would like the listeners to know?
Believe in their own intuition, believe in their own ability to solve their own problems, given the right ingredients, from other people. And they are not alone. And that they can reach out and they can find help from a friend, from a rabbi, from a counselor, a coach, anybody that they feel trusting of. And they can find help. It's all out there, and it's very fashionable now. I mean, when I was growing up, it was very shameful. Something that I grew up with as an adolescent, you shouldn't talk about yourself. That's being conceited.
Right.
Well, now it's like, if you're not talking about yourself, you're not with it.
Right. Okay. How can our listeners connect with you?
Well, they can write me an email at Maggie, Maggie, at maggiebakerphd.com. They can go to my website. They can buy my book, and they can certainly get me through that. I tend not to give out my phone number unless I know somebody.
I don't blame you. Well, all of your links will definitely be in our show notes, so our listeners can find your book, check out your website, read all those blog posts. There's some really great articles in there. And I think this was really a great conversation. And I think that it's very helpful for people because I know so many people in the world struggle, and to know that, you're not alone. There is help out there. I think that's the most important piece.
Right. And the other thing about that I say is, if you're scared to go to therapy or open up to somebody, then read my book. And if you can get enough out of the book, then great. You don't have to go any further. But if you read the book and you still feel awful, then that's a cue that you really do need to talk to somebody who's professionally trained.
Right. And I love that there's the questions at the end because of each chapter, because then you really do have a way to measure whether you can work through some of these things yourself or whether you need, further help. So that's really great. Oh, Maggie, I got 3 questions left for you.
Okay.
Can't let you go just yet. The first one is, what is something you're passionate about that people might not know about you?
Music. I sing in a choir. I used to play the cello, but I have a neuropathy and I just don't have the strength to pull the bow in the same way. So I went over to singing and I just love it. I'm in a choir and my great goal for the next year is to do a solo at church. And
Oh, wow.
I don't know whether I'll ever do it, but I'm acting as if I will do it.
I love that. All right, the second question is, what is your definition of purpose?
I think the definition of purpose is engaging in behavior that is fully absorbing so that time passes. Purpose is when you can get into a flow state of about what you're doing and you just time goes by and you don't even realize it.
Yeah, because you're loving what you're doing, right?
Exactly.
And then if you are in that state, that flow state, then you're in the right place.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, I have one more, and that is there a possibility, a dream or vision you have for the future? Besides your solo in church.
I think I mean, I've joined Business Network International, and I love building relationships with people. And given my advanced age, I mean, I am 83, and I don't have that much time. The tape measure is getting shorter and shorter. And I just love getting engaged with people. I learn so much, and hopefully I give, to them something that they can value. So I think that is a dream. And the other thing is going to the Arctic. And my boyfriend and I are going to the Arctic this summer. And I'm really looking forward to that because my great-grandfather on my father's side and my grandfather were both Arctic explorers and grew up with their stories, and there are several books written about them that I find fascinating. Because I'm alive, they obviously got back alive. One of them almost didn't. And I'm in pursuit of somebody who can tell me how these guys survived temperatures of, -20, -30, going over the ice when they had to abandon the ship and got to Siberia, how they survived those kinds of temperatures for weeks on end. So I'd be very satisfied by the time I'm dying that somebody's able to explain that to me.
Oh my gosh. Maggie, first of all, your mind is not of 83, right? And I think that's more than half the battle is like keeping the mind going, keeping the body going, exploring new things like you're doing. And so you really are a true inspiration.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I don't feel 83, I'll tell you, but
You don't look 83 either.
people tell me I am.
I also want to let our listeners know that Maggie is a contributing author to the upcoming Passion, Purpose, and Possibilities book. So you can find out more about her and her story when that book gets released, which should be pretty soon, in a couple months.
Well, this has been wonderful. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.
I don't think I would have gone into so much detail if I didn't trust you.
Oh, well, thank you. That really is a compliment. I love talking to you. Like I said, you are like really an inspiration, and I love that you're so open to share, your personal stories with people because that's the connection, right? And that's what helps people.
Definitely.
Yeah. So thank you for being a guest.
You're welcome. And to be continued.
Yes, because we have to find out about this trip to the Arctic.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Really interesting.